So now let's turn to a more practical question. How do you actually read an empirical research paper? Well, the first secret trick is that you don't read it from beginning to end. You do not read a paper like you would read a book or a newspaper or anything else. And for that reason, authors don't write papers like they're meant to be read from the beginning to end, because they know that their readers aren't going to do that. So what should you do? Well, first you want to skim the paper to find out four main things. First, what is the point of the paper to begin with? What's their main question? What causal effect are they trying to get at? Second, what's their main result or their conclusion? What's their main finding? Did they answer the causal question they were trying to get? Third, what's their data source? Where is their data coming from? What data are they using? And fourth, what method or identification strategy did they use to draw their conclusion? So this first step, where you just skim the paper to find out these four main things, can usually be done in about 5 minutes or so, especially if the paper is well written and if you're very familiar with the particular question in the context, like, say, the effect of preschool. Now, if you're not familiar with the context or the methods, or the paper is not so well written, it could take a little bit longer. And sometimes debates about the pros and cons of papers can last for years. And indeed, trying to debate these things and figure out exactly what's going on is part of the point of ongoing research. So you're just trying to get a basic idea of what the topic is and what the findings are in your first skim. You don't have to understand everything. Okay, the next thing you want to do is know what's the structure or the typical outline of a paper. So it's going to start with the introduction. Then it'll maybe talk about a mathematical model or just a theoretical discussion of the substantive problem they're trying to tackle. Next, it'll talk about the data sources. What data are they using and where did it come from? Then they'll talk about the institutional details and give you some discussion of the particular context of the data and the policy or the treatment. Then they'll give you some summary statistics of their data. Some means, some standard deviations, some mins and some maxes, just to give you an idea of what the data looks like. Then they'll talk about the empirical strategy. What are they going to use to learn about their main effect? Which of the identification strategies we've talked about in these modules will they use? Then their main result. What's the main finding, the main takeaway from the data and their analysis? After that, they'll give you some other results, stuff that's not as important or interesting as the main result, but still worth writing up and talking about. Then they'll talk about some robustness checks, trying to explore different alternative explanations for their main finding, where here they're really trying to convince you that they've actually found a causal effect of the treatment variable on the outcome variable. Finally, they'll end with the conclusion. Well, they'll just wrap things up and reiterate what their main finding is, talk about some other broader implications, etc. So that's the basic outline of a paper. Now, not all of these sections are always going to be present, and they're not always going to be in that order. So personally, when I pick up a paper, I usually start with the empirical strategy and their main results. Okay, and then I'll work backwards to these other sections. So put differently, I'm going to start by figuring out what their outcome variable is. Okay, what variable are we trying to learn the causal effect on? Okay, second, what is the treatment variable? Okay, so we want to know the effect of a treatment variable on an outcome variable. So what are those in the particular paper? Then I'm going to look for a table or graph that summarizes the main causal effect that they find. Usually there'll be just one table or graph that does that. For example, just like all the ones we've looked at in these modules. So once you find that main table or graph, you can read off what their main finding is, assuming that everything they did was correct. So the next, now that I've got the main finding and I know what they're talking about, I want to know, how did they get this? How did they come to this conclusion? How did they get that number? That is, what was their identification strategy? So which of the methods we've talked about in these modules are they using? So here's where you want to look for keywords like natural experiments or instrumental variables to tip you off on what method they're using. Now here you can often stop reading and go do something else. if you're not interested in the further details, because you've got the main point of the paper. You know their outcome variable, you know their treatment variable, you know what causal effect they found, and that's pretty much the main point of all research in empirical social science. So you can often read a table by just looking at the figures and the graphs. You don't even have to read the body text. If you can just find that main table or graph, you're basically done. Now, suppose you actually are interested in more details about the finding or the institutional context, then you want to read on. The next thing I'll look at is the data sources. Where do they get their data from? What exactly are they using? How do they define their variables? And then what's the relevant institutional context that I should know about? The settings about how things actually worked in practice. This step's going to involve looking at the other tables like the summary statistics and trying to build a context for the main causal effect. So for example, if their main effect is something about the effect of a policy on students' GPA, you'll want to know what's a meaningfully large increase in GPA. So that is, how much variation is there in GPA in the data? The summary statistics table will tell you that. So should I be looking for a 0.2 unit increase in GPA? Is that a large increase? Or is it a 1 unit increase in GPA? I don't know. That's what you have to find out by reading these other sections. After you've done that, I'll look at the robustness checks. These are different analyses that are trying to look at alternative explanations for the finding. They're going to claim, I found the causal effect of a policy on an outcome. And you might say, well, couldn't it be this? Couldn't it be that? Maybe there actually isn't a causal effect. Those are the things they're going to try to explore in this section, where their main point is going to be to convince you that their actual main finding is correct. So last but not least, we're going to look at the introduction, the conclusion, and the theory section. So in the introduction and the conclusion, they're going to try to put their finding in a broader context of the literature and what we know in general about the effects of various policies in these settings. And in the theory section, they're going to try to give you a way of thinking about the situation and thinking about how people are behaving and making choices and how policy may actually work in practice. So this is the one reason you'd leave these to last is that often if you know a lot about a situation, they're just going to be repeating things that you already know. So that's one reason why people often just skip it. So these sections you want to read, especially if you don't know a lot about the previous literature and about the context for this finding. But if you're familiar with the topic, you can just skip them, go straight to the main findings. So that's an overview of how you should actually read empirical papers.